Welcome back to another episode of Psychocinematic. Today's guest is returning once again to talk about his costume design work, but now instead of Shogun on Alien Romulus, and his name is Carlos Rosario. I'm excited to pick his brain, and in case you haven't seen the film yet, there's probably going to be some spoilers in this episode, so beware. Carlos, thank you so much for coming back on here. I was excited to have you, and man, the trailer that we were talking about when you were on here for Shogun, how good Alien Romulus looked, like it didn't disappoint. It lived up to all the hype, if not more, for me. So kudos to you and that whole team.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Before we get into all the other things about your work there, like how big was your team and how long did you have to, work on the designing for the costumes?
We actually prepped this movie in Budapest, in Hungary. So I think I started about November of 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had maybe about, almost maybe 4 months and a half, 5 months of prep. But Christmas was in the middle, so I would say maybe 4 months of prep. I mean, the workshop was pretty big because we had to make all the costumes, and every costume was multiplied about 20, 25 times. So I had about, I think, 3, 4 pattern makers, and each one of them had two seamstresses, one or two seamstresses working for them. And then I think maybe we're about 40 people in total, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like it's a lot for a project like this one that was very contained, but the colony, took us a lot of work to design. It was everything needed to be broken down, and it was hard to put together, to put all that aesthetic and all those elements together. And then every costume was complicated. It needed to be practical. It needed to have a lot of multiples. So for that, I needed, a lot of help to make it happen.
Why did you need so many multiples of the costumes? Just like little variations of them?
No, it's just because, once they get inside the ship,
Mm-hmm.
all the lead actors kind of like go through so much basically.
Mm-hmm.
And every time they go through some kind of action, and then there is blood, acid, or anything that happens to them, you need to kind of keep some of those multiples for that specific scene.
Mm-hmm.
And so in case that they want to go back and reshoot that scene, right? So, for some of them, like for example, Andy, I think was the one that probably had the most different stages. I think he had maybe 8 or 9 different stages.
Mm-hmm.
uh, and Bjorn too, Rain too. And so that's the reason. And also, they have to perform. There was a lot of, gravity scenes,
Mm-hmm.
and that also required harness work. So for that, we needed to make all those costumes in a bigger size.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those costumes are worn not by the actors, but by the stunts. So they need to be in a different size. So that's the
Wow.
reason why we need so many of them. And also, all these actors are dying in very specific ways, right?
Yeah.
And so the costumes needed to be divided sometimes in 2 or 3 different parts to incorporate the prosthetics that were attached to the body of the actor. And so that becomes very technical and complicated. So we needed to have, all those multiples for those reasons.
Gotcha. So when you're approaching the designing, are you given the script beforehand to help inform choices, or are you given a list of like the characters, like we need 25 variations for this one, and like here's what they're gonna be?
Yeah, no, but I mean, they give you the script, and then, my job as a designer is to read the script, do my own breakdown,
Mm-hmm.
and then understand what every scene requires, and so I need to design the costumes to be in alignment with that scene. And my costumes need to perform, specific things in order to make that scene work, right? And so that's really my job. And so when we do the breakdown for every single scene, we kind of make notes about what happens to the costumes. And we need to
Mm-hmm.
start understanding where does the blood, go, and what type of blood it is, what type of color of blood it is, and how does Fede want the blood to look on the costume, right? How
Mm-hmm.
does it get on the costume? And so all that needs to be thought out, all that needs to be, topped with Fede, so we can
Mm.
actually give him what he wants. So it's a long process. And I think this movie, Shogun was much more creative, obviously. We didn't have that many multiples, but this one really was very complicated, technically, I would say.
Well, so you were saying your team was about 40 people, and I think you were saying Shogun was like 130 something. Was that your just the costume department was 130 something on Shogun?
Well, on Shogun, that was my main crew in Vancouver, right?
Mm.
And we
Oh
did
yeah.
have a lot of different people in Vancouver that we couldn't bring to the workshop because we needed more pattern makers and all that.
Hmm.
But then we had different teams in other countries that were helping us to create the stock for the background, help us with the armors, help us to make the stroke capes, the tabbies. And then, we also had a team in Japan that was looking for fabrics for us. So it was a very kind of international crew. In Hungary, it was definitely only my crew in Budapest.
Gotcha. So comparing Shogun with Alien Romulus, Shogun definitely sounds like was more time consuming because you've got multiple like hourish long episodes, but was Alien just more complex overall?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm.
Actually, for me, to be honest, well, Shogun was very difficult. I mean, of course, the creative process required a lot of research and work and all that, but I was pretty much in my element. I think what was hard about Shogun was the endurance, the
Mm.
fact that it was not 10 episodes, it was 10 movies.
Mm.
And you really needed to come up with so much energy to keep going, to keep designing, and also physically, mentally, emotionally was really hard on me and everybody in the crew, especially in a hard winter in Vancouver when it was raining and it was snowy every day for and that was 16 months of my life. So that was really hard. Um, but creatively, it was a fun, exciting, fulfilling, gratifying job, right? It can't get better than that. Shogun was challenging because it was very technical. It was really a lot of multiples. It was about so many meetings with so many different departments to understand what we needed to do in order to make the deaths of all these characters work. And so it's complicated, because, like, for example, for um, when the chest burster comes out of the chest of Navarro, we had to make so many multiples of that Hawaiian shirt and the tank top. And also, we needed to also create a big size costume for the close-ups.
Hmm.
So, Navarro, the actress that plays Navarro is very tiny, but then for the close-ups, we needed to multiply that costume 6 times to make it bigger in order to
Mm.
actually um, allow the DP to create the close-ups, right? So you need to think about so many different things. Or the end, when, for example, Kay gives birth, that was very complicated. That was a
Hmm.
complicated scene to come up with. Bjorn, the same thing, the way he dies was complicated because we needed to create a lot of different acid texture to the t-shirt. So
Hmm.
technically it was complicated. It was really complicated. And it's just nobody really knew how to make it happen. So that we needed to go through a lot of meetings and in order to figure out, with VFX, with the prosthetic department, with the makeup people, with the hair people, with the VFX people, the stunt people, everybody needed to coordinate in order to make it work. So that's when it becomes complicated.
Yeah. So that the chest burster, you're saying that basically everything was scaled up so
Yeah,
that like the practical chest burster could be
exactly.
shot like a close up. Okay.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
Yeah, wouldn't have
But
guessed
that
that.
was just for some of the close-ups because
Hmm.
definitely there was a prosthetic that had been created for Navarro that was her
Hmm.
size, and that prosthetic was attached to her body. And
Hmm.
so the prosthetic was basically on top of the floor, and the body of the actress was actually under the floor.
Mm.
So the costume needed to be divided in two in order to make that scene work. So it requires a lot of thinking and
Yeah.
different departments to make it work.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you're doing these meetings with these other departments. Do you ever get together and then test it out before you're actually going
Oh,
to the screen?
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely, yes.
Cool.
And that's when, you keep continuously, people tell me, wow, there was only a few characters, but we never stopped working from the beginning to the end because of all those meetings. You need to try
Hmm.
things. And then you realize this is not working. Let's just try another way. And then there is all the blood that comes into, and that you need to figure out. And so yeah, it's a lot of meetings, and you need to do camera tests, and you need to show Fede also, see if that's what he had envisioned. And so it's a long process. It just doesn't happen, magically. You need to be prepared. So on the day it happens, right away.
Right. So making an alien film, obviously there's a ton of them out there. So aside from the past alien films, did you use anything else as like sources of inspiration for how you were going to design the costumes?
Yeah, I mean, like for Shogun, I don't really like to just focus too much on references of the other movies,
Hmm.
because it kind of distracts me from what I need to design. When I read a script, I work for that script, and
Hmm.
there's a director that is attached to that script. And so my job is to support his vision. I try to not be too influenced by everything else because then it becomes sort of a little bit of a mental torture of, just kind of looking a little bit everywhere. And I just want to be focused on the vision of the director. Obviously, I've seen the Alien and Aliens movie, so I knew already, what the aesthetic was. But these characters were different. Also, now we're in a different period.
Hmm.
The market is different, the audience is different, they're looking for something different. Also, Fede Alvarez has his own vision that is very different from Ridley Scott and James Cameron. And so, I'm here to support him, and so even though the movie is between the first one and the second one, I feel like it has its own aesthetic and it's a stand-alone movie, right?
Hmm.
But it's true that there is a few things in all these characters that were references to actually those two first movies. And I'll tell you which one they are. It's the Hawaiian shirt for
Hmm.
Navarro. That obviously is a reference to the Hawaiian shirt that Brett was wearing in Alien, right?
Hmm.
And then Kay was a little bit inspired, obviously, by Newt, because I felt like
Hmm.
those two characters were very similar. So basically, those are like things that I thought it would be great to actually tap into those in order to make the fans happy.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that color palette is always important for you designing costumes, and
Mhm.
especially it was for you in Shogun. I'm curious, what did you do with the color in this film for the costumes that you're designing to help you tell Fede's story?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that on this one, I really started mostly with the concept of the colony. That was part of my first conversation with Fede, because in order to design the main characters, we needed to sort of figure out what that colony was going to look like, right? And so he did tell me that in that colony, there would be a few different groups, one of them being the farmers and another one being the miners. And our characters were working within those two groups. So I designed first the colony because it allowed me to actually find the elements to design the clothes for our lead actors, right? And so in this case, it wasn't really the color palette that was the driving force for me. It was about finding the right elements. So I went everywhere in Budapest to find all kinds of vintage pieces that were sort of 80s, because what Fede wanted me to focus on when I was designing the show um, was to make it look as 80s as possible. But not only about, making it look like the 80s, it was about, he told me, try to design this movie as if you were designing it in the 80s. So
Hmm.
the idea of what sci-fi is in the 80s is very different than what it is now, right? So
Yeah.
what was cool then it's very different from what is cool now, right? So it was much more grounded in reality, which in a way works for our characters because that way the audience really connects with them a little bit more, right? So what I
Hmm.
did is that I found all these kind of really cool vintage pieces from the 80s in Budapest. And then in terms of the farmers and the miners, I found a lot of different elements everywhere in the world, but I mostly focused for the farmers in workwear um, that gave me the feel of farmers in America in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So I got a lot of vintage Carhartt pieces,
Hmm.
like thick canvas and thick canvas fabrics. And then for the mining group, I did find a lot of, I got inspired by all this kind of like ski combinations from the 80s that I really broke down. And then I had a lot of like uniforms and military pieces, a little bit mostly from East Europe, right? And I made a lot
Hmm.
of different types of rain gear and deconstructed ponchos. I made hoodies, and I put all of it together to create this very specific look that you see on screen. And then I broke down everything, I aged everything to give it that kind of really dirty, gritty look to show that actually the colony was falling apart. And that was the most important thing, to show the audience that that colony used to be abundant. It was
Hmm.
supposed to be successful, but it's falling apart. And that is really the reason why our characters are actually trying to escape, right? That's really what makes it work, that
Hmm.
sense of hope that they have, that they want to escape that place, right? And so it wasn't really the color palette, it was really per se all these elements, these pieces that I found and that I started styling and putting together. And really gave me that kind of really gritty and dark look.
Hmm. Yeah. How do you go about aging outfits?
Well, I actually had in Budapest a really good textile team,
Hmm.
breakdown team, and they created like I love this. They created this kind of like a puffy fake mud, and it was really beautiful. And I always say this, and every costume designer would tell you the same thing, is that you need to, dirt is also beautiful. You just have to make it look good on camera, right? And it's important because it tells the story of who these people are,
Hmm.
right? And so that was really one of the most important things that we've done. It just gave depth to those costumes. So I had an amazing, textile team that really spent a lot of time literally breaking down every single piece and created that sort of muddy, fake muddy, rubbery, texture that stayed. That
Hmm.
stayed. So that was good because at all times, even though it was raining the day we were shooting, all the clothes were still, kept dirt on
Hmm.
top.
Yeah, because I was thinking like the one way I would know is to like leave it out in the sun, but they don't get sun on that planet, so or on that moon, or
Exactly,
you know.
exactly. Yeah, no, and it's also overdyeing. When we overdye all the clothes, we give them this kind of gray wash. And so it kind of fades everything, kind of kills the colors. And that also was a way for me to kind of harmonize all the colors, bring them to that grayish tone,
Hmm.
and that gives that sort of gritty look to it.
Gotcha.
But there wasn't any color palette because I knew that that colony was going to be multicultural. And so all the elements were a little bit from everywhere. So the color palette in this case was a bit more, out of control than, for example, on Shogun.
Right. So now that you have just done period costumes plus like this retro futuristic style, what do you like more? Like going based on history or the coming up with it on your own kind of thing and doing a futuristic take?
I mean, I like both. I like both. I really like both. It's different. I mean, of course, I enjoyed Shogun because you don't focus as much on the technical part of the costumes, but we didn't have that many multiples to make, yeah, and if we had multiples, it was basically just two, three, that was it. So it's all creative. And when you only need to make one costume, you can get more excited about, what the possibilities, the options that you have. Of course, Alien was amazing because I was very, excited to be part of such an iconic franchise, right? but it was definitely much more mental and technical. And so I would say that, anything that gets me away from too many multiples is always a little bit more exciting. I like period because in a way it keeps you within the boundaries of that period. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of exciting because there is an aspect that is more intellectual, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And so that's exciting for me. There is a lot of research to do, and then you get to the creative part of it. And so I love that combination.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I guess with the period pieces, like with Shogun, you got to just like refer to the paintings and whatnot, and you already have that
Yeah,
kind of clear cut look of what you should be doing. Um,
exactly.
yeah.
But you know what I would love to do is a
Mm,
western, like a very
yeah.
dark and moody western, or maybe some kind of like fantasy fairy tale, like a dark fairy tale, something like that. That would
Hmm.
be cool.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I'm curious with projects that have a lot of green or blue screen. Do you ever get told like, can you please just not dress the actors in green or blue, or will they just go and change the screen, or are they just prepared to have the VFX team do a ton of rotoscoping?
Yes, absolutely. That is so not inspiring when you have to deal with green or blue screen. Sorry. But I got really lucky because I mean you probably read that, it's everywhere online, is that we pretty much didn't really use any green or blue screen
Hmm.
on Alien. I don't even remember one, to be honest
Yeah.
with you. Maybe when we did reshoots, maybe there was one, but that was it. I no, there was, so that was great because everything was practical. Everything
Yeah.
was very real and very grounded in reality. And so that really helps everybody, the actors, me, everybody to kind of like come together and visualize, really know where we are at and what needs to
Hmm.
be adjusted, based on what we see. So
Yeah.
it doesn't become like a visionary thing that, that then the VFX people are going to be able to design on their own. It becomes more of a collaborative effort between all the departments because you're present, you're part of the world,
Yeah.
on set. And so that's very exciting. And Fede was very smart in doing it that way.
When you were on last time talking about Shogun, you mentioned that you met Fede a little while ago. Did you work with him previously? And if so, what film or project was that on?
Yeah, so this is my fourth movie with him.
Oh,
So I
wow.
worked three times as his costume designer when he was my director, and then once where he was my producer.
Okay.
Yeah. So we
Gotcha.
already build a relationship,
Hmm.
and I know what works for him, what doesn't, what he likes, what he does not like. And we speak in Spanish too, so that really
Mm.
helps, makes the process more fun.
Gotcha. So I'd imagine, yeah, that, you guys having a relationship and previous work experience makes things easier. And I'm curious, as a costume designer, what kind of things coming from the director can make your job harder?
Usually when they change their mind like 5 minutes before before shooting,
Hmm.
that's always a little bit tricky. But Fede is always very, decisive. And
Hmm.
so I always, I mean, not just with him, but with all my directors, I always try to avoid that problem. And so you need to, and the same thing with the actors, you try to stay always connected with them all the time. It's not just about you and your ego as a designer, it's a collaborative effort between everybody. And so I'm almost, the way I see my job is that I'm of service
Hmm.
to, to all these different people, and I need to provide to them what they need in order to do their job properly. So I always stay in touch with Fede, and we already kind of have everything approved way before we go to set,
Hmm.
so usually things are approved way before by him, the studio, and everybody, and that way there are no surprises. But I would say that it happens to me, but it is possible that, at the last minute, I'm being called to set, and maybe Fede or another director that I worked with say, well, I'm just thinking that I just changed my mind, or maybe with jacket, without jacket. And so you kind of adjust to what is required.
Gotcha. Okay. And then we have in this film the return of Ash the synthetic. Did you design like his top?
Yeah,
Okay. Cool.
yes. Yeah, so what we did is that we did a lot of research online,
Hmm.
and then also the studio in their archives had everything from Alien and Aliens. I mean, they literally have everything. So they provided us with all the information, the details, close-ups, of everything that was designed in the first and the second movie. But
Hmm.
also something that I thought was kind of absolutely insane is the fact that when we're doing our patches, the Corbellian and, Nostromo and all that, we needed to actually pick the colors that were picked on the patches of the first movies.
Wow.
So we had to literally choose that type of red, that type of blue. And then because all those things go through clearance,
Hmm.
and to be approved by the studio in order for us to actually make them, right?
Dang.
But they provided us with a lot of information and visuals that were very helpful in understanding what we needed to design. But Fede also wanted to do his own take. So actually, the color of that shirt is slightly, I don't know if it really reads on camera, but is goes more towards the blue than the green,
Hmm.
and if I could remember correctly, the shirt that he was wearing in the first movie was mostly towards the green. And in our movie didn't really work that well. So the one that we made was more bluish gray.
Yeah. Gotcha. Well, Carlos, it's been fascinating hearing about all the intricacies of your work on Alien. I would not have guessed how complex those costumes and the multiple iterations that you had to make, and then even for close-ups, just all that stuff is fascinating to hear. And seriously, great work to you and your team.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me again. That's always nice to talk to you.
Yes, of
Thank
course. Hopefully, we can do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you.